Welcome to another session of History Talks in the online Congregational Library. Today we have two guests with us. One is Kenneth P. Minkema, who is the executive editor of the works of Jonathan Edwards and of the Jonathan Edwards Center and Online Library at Yale University. Ken has published extensively on Edwards and early American religion. He also holds an appointment as the to the research faculty at Yale Divinity School and as research associate at the University of the Free State, South Africa. And Ken is going to be talking with Richard Boles about Richard's new book, Dividing the Faith, The Rise of Segregated Churches in the Early American North. Richard is an assistant professor of American history at Oklahoma State University, where he teaches about Native American, African American, and American religious histories. Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to speak with you, Richard, about your new work here. Let me start off by asking you to just summarize briefly some of the major aspects of the book, some of its major contributions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken and Frank, for this opportunity to have a conversation. The drive behind this book was to understand the origins of separate African-American churches in the North. And that was sort of the starting point. But it grew, I think, into a much bigger intervention, in part because I found African Americans and Native Americans participated in far higher numbers of churches across the North than I think other historians had estimated, and that participation in predominantly white churches lasted longer than we tended to think about. We've put so much focus on the rise of Richard Allen's congregation, for example, and a few other separate African-American churches, Thomas Paul's Baptist Church in Boston, for example. We focus so much on those fascinating and important stories. I think we missed the fact that some African-Americans, for a variety of reasons, continued to participate in predominantly white churches even after the first wave of separate Black churches was founded. And I think we also have mixed some of the complexity by focusing sort of only on Native American history or only on African American history or sort of only on church history, and trying to bring those three together in this book, I think, reveals some of the shared experiences of Indigenous people and African Americans, but also the ways that they diverge. So New England's Indigenous people are founding separate churches several decades before Black New Englanders are, and so that's an important part of the story. But the main, I think, overall argument could be summarized as the churches were more interracial across the North than historians have estimated. They became more interracial during the Revolutionary era and into the early Republic before a steep drop-off. And because churches were so interracial, they had a major role in shaping race relations across Northern society. And then when they do divide along racial lines, essentially churches are giving moral sanction to segregation.
So before we dive into some of the particular issues and contributions of the book, I see that among your previous vocations, you served as an interpretive park ranger for the Park Service, in which you led tours in Boston around African-American historic sites. Could you talk a little bit maybe about how that might have helped to inform this particular work, or is this kind of part of a larger sort of arc of your own personal interests?
Yeah, that's directly related to the origin of this book. So I did a BA and an MA degree in history from Boston College. Finished the MA, and what am I going to do? And I got a job as a national park ranger in Boston, giving tours of the Black Heritage Trail. And that trail ends at the 1806 African Meeting House, the oldest extant African-American religious building in the country. The story really focuses on the 19th century and even the antebellum era, the abolitionist movement, the famous abolitionists who gathered there, who lived in this community, who worked in this community, who prayed in this community, and their stories. But I knew that the first enslaved Africans had arrived in Boston in 1638, we believe. So were there African-American Christians, were there Black Christians in Boston, 1638 to 1805? And I wasn't really satisfied with the answer that I was seeing in the scholarship. And so it made me wonder, well, were there African-American Baptists in the 1760s? Were they Anglican? Were they Congregational? I wanted to know more. And the other thing that I found out in I looked at abolitionist churches as part of that job. And so looking at some of the Unitarian and Congregational churches on Beacon Hill and in Boston that were promoting an end to slavery in the South, I noticed some African-American members of these predominantly white churches. And so that sort of made me wonder, what is it that encouraged some African-Americans to not be a member of the Black Methodist Church or the Black Baptist Church, but instead join with Theodore Parker, or even in some cases join with a more conservative, predominantly white church. And so those two questions sort of led me to the church records in the earlier time periods, and I sort of went back and back and back until I got back to the 1730s.
Yeah. Okay. So, what percentage were there of people of color, natives, and Africans in colonial New England churches? Perhaps it's different on the coast, in the seaports as opposed to inland. But talk a little bit about that, and maybe talk too about who were they, and maybe tell us about some specific individuals that you might want to lift up from your research that particularly struck you.
Yeah, so the percentages vary widely across the North. And so my book covers sort of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, up to Maine.
Yeah.
Certainly New York and New Jersey have the highest percentage. New York City has the highest percentage of anywhere in the North. In New England, there are parts of Rhode Island, Newport, Kings County, Narragansett area of Rhode Island that have pretty high proportions. Boston certainly has the largest number of African Americans, mostly enslaved people of New England. Mm-hmm. So not more than 10% of the population in any of these places, much more likely in many, and it changes over time, obviously, much more like 3 to 6% of the population in lots of parts of New England. But I think that there needs the important distinction. The experience of enslavement in Boston or Newport is going to be very different than the experience of slavery across the rest of New England. There are enslaved people in, it seems like most every New England town in the 18th century. There's probably not very many towns that didn't have, that have been settled for at least a little while, that didn't have enslaved people there. Some of them are enslaved Native Americans, but mostly enslaved Africans. But there we're talking sometimes just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. And so it's a very different experience than in the more urban environments where you can have a larger concentration. And there, the 18th century is the main century of importation from Africa. So in the 18th century, we see the highest numbers of people coming directly from Africa into New England, or coming from other slave plantation societies, the Deep South, the Caribbean, into North America. So a couple examples that come to mind, Phyllis Wheatley's one of the more famous enslaved New Englanders, and she is captured and sold to European slave traders when she's maybe 5, 6, or 7, does the transatlantic slave trade, cut the Middle Passage, and ends up in Boston, and is purchased as a very young child. And so growing up really in slavery in Boston shapes a lot of her experience. I think a very different example, an earlier example, is someone by the name of John Vingus, who I'm just fascinated by. And wish I could have found more about John Vingus. John Vingus joins the anti-revival sort of conservative Hollis Street Congregational Church in the 1730s. He joins through only the covenant, the halfway membership category. It appears that he joins solely for the purpose of having his daughter baptized, Sarah. So he formally affiliates with the church. The church sort of accepts him by owning the covenant, and Sarah's baptized, all right in this same period, early 1730s. But the church records note that, and John wasn't baptized because John had already been baptized, and the records describe him as being baptized in his own country by a Romish priest. So this could have been the Kingdom of Congo, which has a long-standing independent Catholic church. It could have been Spanish or Portuguese colonies where he may have been baptized. My reading of this source suggests that for John Vingus, his faith, his Catholicism was important to him, and the desire to have a daughter baptized led him to affiliate with this church. John Vingus was free. We don't know how he arrived in Boston. He was married by a different congregational minister to a free Black woman, I think maybe 6 or 7 years before Sarah was baptized. And so here's this free person, a person who is in Boston. We don't know for how long, but is there and is free and values access to sacrament of baptism enough to affiliate with this predominantly white congregational church in order to have Sarah baptized. There's a lot of other stories we could probably look to. Lots of them we don't know the origins. We don't know if they're New England born. But a lot of enslaved parents clearly wanted their children to be baptized, and especially by the mid-18th century, a lot of people who were clearly born into slavery in New England are being baptized, and their parents, also enslaved, are there standing for them up there, usually probably at the front of the church with their children being baptized. Sometimes the adults have been baptized in years prior. Sometimes the adults and the children are being baptized together at the same moment.
Yeah. What did church membership mean to Africans and to natives, you think? Can you get a sense of that?
Yeah, certainly there are a wide variety of motives that affected Black Indigenous people who are affiliating with the churches. And you can get at some of the different motives. So certainly some people decide just to attend. Some people decide to affiliate as a halfway member for the Congregationists or a full member in some cases. Some people are going clearly to get specific benefits like education. A really high number of African Americans going to Anglican churches in the North because those Anglican churches are teaching them how to read. So there's clearly a mix of motivations, and it's not necessarily clear cut. We can sort of see a range, a spectrum of motivations, and as complex people, there's poles that are both sort of spiritual or material that are influencing their decisions to join these churches. But I think one of the really important things here is that this is a public space, a public institution in the 18th century, congregational churches, that can confer a degree of status that is not attainable to enslaved people otherwise. But to be a church member was important, was a degree of status, to be baptized, to own the covenant, to be recognized as a Christian in this community mattered a great deal. Just like to be disciplined in this community, to be kept from communion or to be expelled from the church was a weighty social penalty, as well as a religious one. And so enslaved people, Native Americans, know where power resides in their communities. They're astute. They understand how the society works, especially if they're born in that society. And so going to the churches gives them potentially allies, gives them potential literacy, gives them spiritual power, gives them a whole range of motivations. With some people, we like Phyllis Wheatley, we have her words where she's talking about being comforted. Cuffy Wright, Anna Wright, they write about being comforted by reading scriptures, by prayer, by being a part of these churches. So no simple answer there.
Yeah. The implication, of course, of African and indigenous church membership for whites was that they were to be treated as spiritual and equals, as brothers and sisters. And that was one of the real objections that whites, especially slave owners, had to that. Do you think then that could there have been a measure even of resistance on the part of Africans and indigenous who put themselves forward for church membership, a way of asserting themselves and saying, yes, you do need to treat us as, and I am worthy to be treated as a spiritual equal, as a child of God. That struck me as something that would possibly motivate them as well, that there was this, there's the comfort, but then there's also this whole notion of, and I'm roughly paraphrasing from an African American's lay relation of the 18th century. He's talking about justice must take place, right? So there may be that element of pushback, of resistance there as well to that. That's just something that struck me as I was reading it. So I don't know if you have anything to add.
You were referring to Greenwich, who gives his anti-slavery sermon in in this predominantly white church in Connecticut in the mid 18th century, and it's long before white Congregationalists are making anti-slavery claims, right? It's long before Samuel Hopkins and others develop a sort of congregational anti-slavery. I really, really wish I knew, the reaction of that congregation, the reaction of the person who claimed to own Greenwich. We don't know, but remarkably, the church saved a copy of what he said, and remarkably, the church pursued him for membership. The church said, "Hey, you haven't been coming for a while. Come back," and he becomes a full member. But doesn't gain his freedom until the Revolutionary era. So it's a fascinating example.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we think of when we say anti-slavery, we usually only think of it in terms of organized white movements. But we have to remember that African Americans and Native Americans would have made countless anti-slavery acts during this whole period, right? They would have been engaged in these. They just weren't recorded because they weren't organized. They were below the radar, as it were. I think that's always an important thing to bear in mind about it.
That's right. Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot of opposition to African Americans participating in churches. I think historians have overemphasized that a little bit, and maybe because we're drawing more from sources in the South, and I think the difference between the North and South is important here. I did see a lot of opposition to including African Americans in Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, and Presbyterian churches before the Revolutionary era. More often than opposition, I saw some Congregationalists and Anglican ministers sort of lament that white people are not taking their faith seriously enough, and that if they took their faith more seriously, then they would, be bringing their enslaved people to church. So it was almost apathy to religion in general that was more of the problem than direct opposition of slave owners to slave people participating in churches.
Yeah. So you mentioned church records before, so let's get a little bit into the sources you found, because they're wonderful. Talk a little bit about what sources you used, what the church records and others, and what kind of information do these things yield?
Yeah, so I looked at some part of the church records for over 400 congregations in the North. And that includes most Northern denominations. Probably the largest share were congregational church records. And I went to about 27 different archives to look at these, and some online as well. And church records tend to identify people in relationship to the white male head of household. Daughter of, son of, wife of, widow of, so that also falls in line for servant of, slave of.
Yeah.
And so that we might call patriarchy of the records actually means that the church records are full of racial notations, full of notations of status, enslavement or servitude. And so it was a process of looking through lists of baptisms, looking through lists of members, looking at discipline records, looking at lists of marriages, sort of the records that genealogists use frequently, but maybe not the most used by historians in terms of church history, or we pay a lot of attention to them in terms of revivals and things like that, but they're not necessarily systematically studied by a huge number of historians.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't know we know like Phyllis Wheatley, we know Greenwich, we know some of these other people's stories with a little bit more detail, but there's a whole lot, really thousands of African Americans who appear in the church records briefly. We get a name, we get maybe a relationship or status, but not a whole lot else. So what it became clear to me was that the best way we can understand these people who we don't have their words is to sort of follow the pattern. The actions of African Americans and Native Americans, I think, speaks loudly through these baptismal and membership records. We don't necessarily know their individual stories, but when you have hundreds of examples of baptisms happening in this way, and you can make a case that their actions are telling us something, because we're seeing these trends. So it became important to me to look at a wide swath of records and count and track and keep account of when are people affiliating, with what types are they affiliating, what types of churches are they affiliating with, how does that affiliation rates change over time. And that's a way that these people whose voices didn't make it into the archives can still speak to us, I think, about their experiences, their religious experiences in particular. And so I kept reading church records until I got to the point where I could predict what I was going to find. Like I said, it's this denomination and it's this year. I know what I'm going to find here. And when I got to that point, it's like, okay, I think I've looked at enough church records. So I don't need to keep doing this.
Okay. All right. And so the period you're looking at, from the mid 18th century, of course, is distinguished so much by the Great Awakening. And that's usually seen as very formative for African American and Native American churches, the formation of these, the way that empowers the marginalized, and so forth. So how was the Great Awakening important for the formation of African American and Native American churches? How did it contribute to segregation?
Yeah, the Great Awakening is certainly really important, and we've known that for a while. We've paid a lot of attention. Thomas Kidd and others have paid attention to the most radical revivalists, Daniel Rogers, sort of North Shore of Boston, one example, Davenport, other revivalists, Whitfield, who are sort of going out of their way to preach to, welcome to, encourage conversion of Black and Indigenous people. So we've sort of known that story for a while. And it's an important story. And without a doubt, some of these enslaved people resonate and find Christianity in these revivals in ways that they didn't or wouldn't have in other religious contexts. I think of the confession, the testimony of an enslaved woman named Flora from Ipswich in the 1760s. Again, I think of Phyllis Wheatley writing a poem after George Whitefield dies. Clearly strong connections here to the revivalism. And many of the revivalist churches, such as Old South and Brattle Street in Boston, they have generally the highest numbers and highest percentages of Black people being baptized and joining the churches during the revival period. But our focus there, I think, has missed something of the other things that are going on in the time period that are not connected to revivalism. We often see Charles Chauncey quoted as being opposed to revival and sort of commenting, one of the problems of the revival is that you've got uneducated African Americans preaching, right. Chauncey says. But Chauncey's own church is baptizing African Americans. So churches that were opposed to the revival are still including some African Americans through baptism and membership. And really, even as the revival is going in Boston, the Anglican churches of Boston are baptizing similar rates of African Americans as these revivalist congregational churches. And they were, again, sort of opposed to Whitfield's changes. So there are a lot of African Americans who are participating in churches, but in ways that are not connected to the revivalism. Yeah. And so I thought that was an important point to bring to the fore.
Another phenomenon of the Great Awakening is the separation that occurs in congregations, or the forming of new, more radical congregations, and one of and that also includes a separate Native American churches. Could you talk a little bit about what accounted for the rise of these particular kinds of congregations?
Yeah, definitely. So there had been independent Native American churches in Massachusetts since the mid 17th century, right? They started as the praying towns, and the churches at Natick and Martha's Vineyard and Mashpee, continued throughout the 17th century and continued throughout the 18th century. But there weren't that same sort of tradition of indigenous churches among the Narragansetts, Pequots, Mohicans, Shinnecocks, Montauk's. And as Linford Fisher has shown in his book, The Indian Great Awakening, there is a gradual engagement of accepting teachers, learning to read, hearing messages about Christianity among Narragansetts, Pequots, Mohicans, and others from the early 18th century. And then there is a pretty large spike in their joining churches. Mohicans, Pequots, Narragansetts join, in many cases, revival churches, such as those in New London, or Westerly, Rhode Island, in pretty large numbers in the 1740, 1741, 1742 period, often joined through only the covenant and baptism. But pretty rapidly, by the end of the 1740s, many of them have stopped. And I think that the Narragansett case is a good example. The predominantly white congregational church where many Narragansetts affiliated encouraged evangelical devotional activities, right? Pray in your families, pray in small groups, read the Bible or study scripture in small groups. And it was really sort of easy for the Narragansetts who had already been autonomous, independent, have their own land reserve, somewhat of at a distance from the predominantly white meeting house, to say we can do this on our own. We don't need to be part of the white church. And they realized pretty quickly too that affiliating with the white church didn't solve the problems they were facing about land theft and other issues that they were facing. And when they experienced inequality, when they're not treated really as equal Christian brothers and sisters, and in fact, when they're held to different standards and disciplined more often, or when one of their community members, Samuel Niles, is disciplined for preaching, then they say, there's nothing else we really need from this church. We can go our own way and found our own church. And you also had actually many English congregationalists who are advocating a separatist doctrines and theology, saying that sort of true Christians should separate and form new congregations. Those divisions, the splinters of congregational churches throughout the 1740s seems to have influenced Narragansetts and others as well. Right? If these white people can go off and found a Baptist church, well, why can't we go off and found our own church as well? And so they do, and most Narragansetts, they ordained Samuel Niles to be their minister, and he has a career as a minister of the Narragansett Church.
Yeah. Moving ahead a little bit in time, the Revolution and afterwards, what was the connection between the end of the slave trade and of slavery in the States and the rise of the independent Black churches?
Certainly, the end of slavery was an important contributor to the ability of African Americans to found their own churches. The South, there were independent Black churches in places like Savannah, Charleston in the South, where there were a pretty large core free Black population, even as slavery continued. But if the vast majority of the population is enslaved, or it's just impractical to be able to build your own church, maintain your own church. So the rise of freedom, the gradual end of slavery. African Americans gained freedom from military service in the Revolution. They gained it through private manumissions, and very, very, very slowly through children being born after the Gradual Emancipation Acts, and in Massachusetts, the court cases that gradually ended slavery. And so once you get a core population that's free, it's employed, that has some professionals, some even successful businessmen in the Black community, then you have enough resources to make the switch possible. So that's an important piece of why after the Revolution, why after slavery's begun to end, do separate Black churches get founded after 1790. But there's another piece as well, and I think it's easier, and this is maybe ironic, but easier to include African Americans or Native Americans in a colonial church because the church reflects the hierarchy of society. You are all subject of the king. No one is calling for freedom and equality for everybody. In 1740, 1750, monarchy is the accepted and hierarchy is the accepted norm of society, and churches reflect that. They have seated segregation by wealth and status and gender sometimes and race. After the Revolution, you're arguing for freedom, the rights of man, that everyone is born free and equal.
Yeah.
And it becomes a little bit harder to maintain that racial hierarchy in churches when you've got a gospel message that says spiritual equality, and you've got a political message in society that says we're republic and that all men are born free and equal. And there's more of a rub that the segregation, the second class status for Black and Native American Christians is more glaring, I think, when you are in the republic, the early republic. And as slavery is ending, many white people in the North are concerned about the bad effects of freedom will have on their society. And racism in some ways grows as a way to keep marginalized African Americans. And so you get an increase in sort of the need for segregation, the desire for segregation, at the same time that the ideas of society seem to be, the hypocrisy of that is clearer. And African Americans push for equality in churches, and when it's not achieved, they say, well, we can go on our own way. And the most important reason that the founding Black pastors gave for Black churches in the North was a religious one. They noted this, they noted segregation, they noted inequality, but they always said that the reason we're doing this is for the glory of God, that we can convert more of our brethren, we can evangelize better in separate churches, and there we will welcome more people into the church through these separate institutions, and that is always given as a positive reason for separate Black churches in the early republic.
Well, our we're just about out of time here, but I maybe one more question here. Maybe you can answer it. Try to answer it briefly. So, looking then a little further on in the antebellum period, 1820 to 1850, what happened during that period to make the North the first thoroughly segregated society in the U.S. as you depict it?
Yeah, there's an English visitor who comments that there's an aristocracy of color in the North, that African Americans are excluded from every profession where they would work alongside with white people, professions that they held in the colonial era in some cases. And schools are segregated, churches have become segregated, neighborhoods are becoming increasingly segregated, and theaters, public, every aspect of society becomes segregated. Moreover, there are some northern states that allowed African Americans to vote if they were property owners following the revolution. At the same moment that universal white male suffrage is extended, the possibility of any African Americans voting is retracted. Mm-hmm. And there are some urban riots against the free Black communities. Some of these riots burn houses and businesses, but some of them also attack African American churches. So it's a moment of really intensified, deliberate segregation that is promoted by the law and through mob violence and other social norms. And in that moment, a few African Americans say that the solution to racism is actually reintegration. We need to reintegrate churches to end this segregation and racism. But the majority, David Walker, I talked a lot about, William Apis, Native American Methodist, Frederick Douglass, and others make the similar point that really it's white Christians in the North who need a reformation, who need a fuller conversion or total conversion to the message of Christianity, to the peaceful religion of Jesus, to really solve the racism and segregation in the North.
Well, Richard, it's been a pleasure to speak to you about your work. There certainly are. I have many other questions. It's certainly very rich, and I encourage folks to go out and get a copy and read it and benefit from it, because I benefited myself very much. So I really appreciate the work and the thought that you put into this study. Very good. And we'll end it there. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you both for a great and stimulating discussion. And I join Ken in hoping that as people, get off this history talk, they're going to be rushing to Amazon to get their own copy of the book. So again, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.